I think that song's pretty outstanding in the sense that it really deals with an honest piece of this conversation about how we engage with constructs around things that are sometimes difficult to talk about, right? Well, 14 years ago, so the summer right after my wife and I got married, we were gifted the opportunity to go down to Cancun. And so that's where we went on our honeymoon. And it was a great opportunity just to kind of do a little bit of snorkeling and do a little bit of hanging out on the beach, doing that kind of things, exploring some of the ruins and some of the different towns around Cancun. One of the things that you should know about me, though, is this. If I have the opportunity to, and it's nice outside, I will almost always wear sandals. Because I love sandals, and they just feel so nice. They can feel like the sand to my toes, that kind of thing. And I know that's a little bit weird, but we were out exploring one day in one of the little communities, and my sandal broke. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience before where you're like walking around with a pair of sandals and like the strap just doesn't work anymore. It feels weird. You feel like you've got a busted tire and you're just like, kind of limping around. And that's kind of what happened. And so fortunately, just across the street from where we were at the ruins, there were a bunch of these little shops. And if you've ever been into like Latin America or anywhere like in Mexico, you've seen these like little shops. And they had this little shoe shop. So I went in and they had every kind of shoe imaginable. So I looked around, I was like, I don't speak much Spanish, but Morgan does. And I was like, I need sandals. I need a pair of sandals. And he kind of looked around and, like I said, he had almost every kind, except for a kind that would fit me. You see, I wear size 12. Like these are actually skis for most people. And as I was trying to find a pair of shoes, he couldn't find a pair in his shop that fit. But he was not going to be prevented from helping me on that day. And so he came up with this idea. He was going to march us down the street, screaming a 3-word phrase that would help me find what I was looking for. Los zapatos grandes. Los zapatos grandes, which means the big shoes. And so on our honeymoon, Morgan and I are walking through the streets of one of the little villages just outside of Cancun, being known as Los Zapatos Grandes. Fortunately, after the 3rd or 4th place that we went, I found a pair of Los Zapatos Grandes, right? Because of his assistance, because of his help. But it got me to thinking about how often it is that we may experience the same thing, not just with shoes, but with everything from our diets and meal plans to exercise plans to the way the education system is set up or the economy or our relationships or religion. And that is this, that we often go to a place and get told that there should be a one-size-fits-all solution, that you should be able to go there and find it because there's something for everyone. And that feels great until you're excluded from the everyone. I mean, sure, if you would describe yourself as completely average and normal, which I don't think there's anyone in this room that would say that, then maybe you've never felt out of place. But at least for me, when what is available seems to work for everyone but me, I feel like I can transition to this place of going from joy that I'm going to be able to get what I need to feeling completely overwhelmed again because it just doesn't seem to fit. One of my friends, a guy by the name of Joe Smith, that's his real name, he's an ex-evangelical pastor down in Gainesville, Florida, and he recently wrote this. I thought it was really wise when it comes to being overwhelmed about things. He said, feeling overwhelmed is not a failure of faith. It is a sign your body still knows how to feel. And that's sacred. Just let that sit for a second. I think it's really, really good. Because oftentimes, when we feel overwhelmed, people seem to try to rush in and give us the one-size-fits-all solution. And when that doesn't work, it can feel even worse. And they're not doing it with ill intent, right? They're doing it with the best that they've been taught, saying things like, you're going to get through this. Or this is all a part of God's bigger plan, whatever that means. Or, hey, I saw this new thing on TikTok and it seems to be working for everyone. And then it doesn't work for us. But try as we might, those things don't seem to cut through the stresses and the overwhelms. They don't find the solution to our need for los zapatos grandes the way that we want. Which is exactly why we're doing this series right now, where we're talking about the fact that we can cut through the stress. Because we know that so many of us have been overwhelmed. We've been stressed, we've been confused, only to be met with one-size-fits-all solutions. And sometimes it can feel even worse when the one-size-fits-all solution fits everyone but us. So today, for about the next 20 to 23 minutes, we're going to explore the possibilities that there are tools that might be able to help us cut through the stress, cut through the overwhelm that we're feeling, but that those tools might be a little bit different for you than they are for me, and they might be a little different for me than they are for the person sitting next to you. You know, just like your shoe size is different, it's not going to always look the same. But to help us all cut through this, I have this big thought for today that I want us to kind of land in when we leave today, and that's this. That finding the tools that are created for us can help cut through the overwhelm. I'm going to say that again because it's really the main takeaway that I want you to leave this morning with, and that's this. That finding the tools that are created for us can help us cut through the overwhelm. I mentioned last week that when we surveyed people here at the venues earlier this year and asked, in one word, how are you doing? Seriously, we just wanted one word. And the number one word that came up by more than double any other answer was overwhelmed. And it's something that happens not just here at the venues, but I think it happens everywhere. When we see the news, when we're getting ready here in just a couple of weeks to go back to, I'm actually not going to say the S word, there's too many teachers and too many students who don't want that word to come up yet. But when we're getting ready for all these things, we're trying to balance our budget and we're seeing all of these other things where there just seems to be more month than there is money. And then it seems like everyone around us just keeps adding on to that. It feels like maybe we need some tools to help cut through that. One of my favorite comedians, Jim Gaffigan, describes how it feels sometimes when you feel overwhelmed. I want you to take a quick look at this video. I think that's on point though, right? Morgan and I don't have kids, but I've been told that that's how it kind of feels sometimes as families grow. But I think it's true not just for families, but for so many of the other things that so many of us juggle on a regular basis, right? We feel overwhelmed, and then someone comes to us with the best of intention and says, hey, can you do this thing too, right? And it feels like we're drowning, and someone hands us something else. And I imagine many of us have tried all kinds of tools in the past to fix this, to cut through the overwhelm. We've been told that if we just do the Marie Kondo, like, does this thing spark joy? That maybe that'll, and maybe it will. Maybe that works for you, and that's awesome. Or we've looked at our finances and it hasn't worked, and someone says, have you ever tried Dave Ramsey? And maybe that works for you, and that's great. And maybe it doesn't. And when it doesn't seem to work out that way, especially when it seems to work out for other people, it can again just seem to overwhelm us more and more. There's this story that shows up in both the Christian Bible, the Jewish scripture, as well as in the Quran, by the way, that I think most of us probably have some basic idea of. But I think it talks a lot about how the right tools when people feel overwhelmed can actually help us cut through. And so I want to offer this story this morning to help us kind of process this. Like I said, it's a story that many of us are probably familiar with, the story of David and Goliath. And it shows up in the book of 1 Samuel. And let me just say this up front. While there is a lot of debate about this story, for example, there are multiple stories about how Goliath dies. Last time I checked, most people don't die in multiple different ways, right? And there are stories about who kills him that are different. There are all kinds of debates about even if this story is factual. One of the things here at the venues that we really prize is the fact that here at the venues, we take the Bible seriously, but we don't necessarily always take it literally, because a lot of times truth can be deeper than just the words that we initially see there as well. And so this story, though, has so entered our cultural mind, it's so entered our cultural zeitgeist, that it gets used all the time for all kinds of different things. In fact, just this last week, here were some of the different headlines that I read that talked about David and Goliath. For example, it was used to describe different wines in Wine Business Monthly, which is a magazine that we subscribe. I shouldn't say that. It's a magazine that describes the different wines that we have here. It got used to describe some water rights that are happening in Michigan. It got used, by the way, this is odd, to describe how Israel evolved from the Middle East David to Goliath, which is a little bit culturally awkward, if you kind of know the story and kind of talking about how different people function that way. And ultimately, David versus Goliath was a season of Survivor as well. Those of you who know me know that I love Survivor, so if I can talk about it for 4 seconds, I will. But this was a season that was all themed around the book by Malcolm Gladwell called David versus Goliath. And it was the season that Mike White, the guy who wrote and directed and produced The White Lotus, was on. So if you're ever interested in a great season to start Survivor on, that would be it. But as a quick recap, if you aren't familiar with this story, the story is that there is this group of people called the Israelites who are in a conflict with the Philistines. And in that day, you didn't exactly fight wars the same way that we think about wars today. There were no drones, there were no targeted attacks. And instead, what they would do is they would just like march their armies toward each other and engage in kind of this hand-to-hand combat. But because of the geography where the border between the two people groups were set, which is the Valley of Elah, there was this constant space where it didn't make sense for people to actually attack each other. Because in order to get to the other side, you'd have to go down into the valley and then come back uphill, which meant that whoever was on defense had the advantage of not only knowing you were coming, but having the high ground as well. And so it's in that kind of space that we actually see where this story starts. And so reading it out of 1 Samuel, it says this, that a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. In other words, what they decided to do was send out their biggest warrior, this guy named Goliath, a guy who definitely had los zapatos grandes. And depending on the way that we understand Hebrew, he was either 6'9" or 9'9". Doesn't really matter, he was just a big guy. And he was going to challenge the Israelites to bring out someone who would fight him directly. And while many of us know that part of the story, there's a part here that I underlined on purpose that I think is an important starting place for the story that we often overlook. And that is the fact that Goliath came out of the Philistine camp. In other words, Goliath was a product of his system. He wasn't just a random person who wanted to pick on another random person. Instead, he was a person who came from a very specific place and time, which is actually the very first step in this morning's teaching, and that's this, that often the things that feel overwhelming come from a system that was designed to feel overwhelming. Oftentimes, the things that feel overwhelming come from a system that was designed to feel overwhelming. The reason the Philistines sent out Goliath wasn't because they wanted the Israelites to feel comfortable. They didn't want them to feel safe. They wanted them to be absolutely scared. They wanted to intimidate them. They wanted them to feel like they were small, that they had no chance. And I wonder how often we find ourselves in that space, right? We find ourselves at the end of a paycheck with still more month, and we wonder why this is always the case. We decide that we really want to eat healthy, and then we go to the store and realize that the system is designed such that ice cream tastes better than broccoli. And we find these reminders all the time that the system is set up to get the results that the system gets. In 1962, which was before the Civil Rights Act, before Martin Luther King led the March on Washington, and nearly a decade before the moon landing, there was a kindergarten class in Chicago where the teacher went around and asked all the students, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm sure there were a variety of answers: a firefighter, a teacher, a baseball player, a parent. But when the teacher got to a 6-year-old with the name of Mae Jemison, her answer was that she wanted to be a scientist. And the teacher, trying to make sure that the dreams didn't escape this little girl, probably a product of her system, looked down at her and said, you mean you want to be a nurse? You see, nothing wrong with nursing at all, obviously, but at that time, it would have been unthinkable for a 6-year-old black girl to think that she could have been a scientist. But over the next 30 years, May would go on to Stanford and then to Cornell, where she would study chemical engineering as well as African American studies. And then she'd go to med school and become a medical doctor and go to Africa and work as a medical doctor. And then in 1992, she became the first black woman to travel into space as a part of NASA. I want you to hear what she says about the time when she was told that she could become a nurse. She said, "Never be limited by other people's limited imaginations. If you adopt their attitudes, then the possibility won't exist because you'll have already shut it out. You can hear other people's wisdom, but you've got to reevaluate the world for yourself." You see, Dr. Jemison had all of the cards stacked against her. The system of the time could not imagine a world where she could become a scientist, let alone where she could become an astronaut or a doctor. And in a similar way, this story of David and Goliath says it this way, that Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down and fight me." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And I wish that I could tell you that the story speeds up, that after the time of the story of David and Goliath, or after the story of Dr. Jemison, that suddenly all of these things got better, that we live in a world of no oppression, that we live in a world of no racism or no sexism or no homophobia. I wish I could tell you that that has finished. But truthfully, the implicit and explicit systems continue to push down. A recent report by MIT said it this way, that there is significant loss of talent at every stage of the academic career pipeline for female graduates, to female postdocs, to female assistant professors, and to female tenured professors because of systemic barriers such as bias and discrimination. A hostile or unwelcoming work environment in STEM disciplines can discourage women from pursuing careers. And maybe that's one of the truths about this whole process that we need to recognize, that the system right now is overwhelming, because of course it is. That the system right now is overwhelming because of course it is. It's something that was really helpful for me, by the way, during the COVID transitions, was to learn this phrase, of course it is, right? When we started the transition out of COVID, I was a teacher at a public high school. And there were all of these fights that I would have with students where it was like, "No, you're supposed to wear your mask." And they were like, "No, I don't want to wear my mask." And the reason they fought me was because of course they did, right? Or I'd go to the store to pick up oranges, and they wouldn't have enough oranges because there had been supply chain issues or because there weren't enough employees. Because of course there were. And even today, we see this a lot, whether it's the cost of goods that seem to be rising faster, the conflicts going on around the world, the way that politicians seem to speak out of both sides of their mouth, or one of the most disgusting stories that I've seen in a long time, which is the story about the whites-only community that is looking to move into Springfield, because of course they are. Fortunately, by the way, our city manager said no, right? Said that there's no space for racism, there's no space. And while I wish that would spill over to all of the other areas of oppression as well, those problems continue to exist because of course they do. And when we're faced with that kind of systemic issue, where we don't have any control over what's happening, I think sometimes just saying, of course that's the way it is, can result in one of two options. Either it results in a resignation that we can't change anything, or as a motivation to figure out how to make a difference. And that is where I think this story is so helpful. Because the second main movement in this morning's talk is this, that our choice does not have to be resignation to the oppression around us. That our choice does not have to be resignation to the oppression around us. I want you to hear how this story continues. While everyone else is cowering with good reason because of Goliath, David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior since his youth." You see, Saul's the king. David's basically a nobody. The system is stacked against him, not just because he's young, but because everyone else, those in power, seem to feel like the only option is resignation. I don't know if you've ever felt this way before. You've looked around and seen the world, and you're like, this shouldn't be how it is. But everyone keeps telling you that you're not enough to solve it, right? That you're not rich enough, or you're not smart enough, or you're not male enough, or you're not straight enough, or you're not connected enough, or you're not enough. And here at the Venues, we want to say very specifically that you are enough. Period. You are enough. You are enough right as you are. And that here at the Venues that we are not going to choose the path of resignation. It's true not just because I say it's true, but it's true because of the way that you all continue to live it. Yes, Springfield and areas around here continue to do things, because of course they do, that make taking care of our unsheltered population harder. We keep saying we want to go feed people on Thursday nights, and they keep closing down the parks from the feedings. And yet you all continue to find ways to make sure that 52 weeks a year, hungry people get food, right? There are people all the time, including faith spaces, that say we don't need to worry about the oppression that's happening to queer people or women. In fact, recently, Baylor University, a college that's the largest Baptist college in the world, had accepted a grant, free money, to study the oppression of women in the queer community in the church. And then they turned it down and gave it back because of things like this, where a reverend said, it's much better to send your child to a secular university hostile to the faith than to a Christian university like Baylor. And the flaw is that when we can have all of these pushbacks, it can feel like resignation is our only choice. And while we could resign ourselves to the fact that the world is getting less inclusive, here at the Venues, we're going to push the other direction. And that's you all for doing that. Thank you. It's one of the main reasons, by the way, that we've developed the teaching team that we have here at the Venues, right? It's part of our value of inclusion and affirmation. Look, we could just resign ourselves to the fact that just like every generation before us, we're going to listen to old, white, straight, married dudes. But instead we say, no, we should have a team of people who bring different perspectives. People like Amanda, who did our introduction earlier today. People like Nick, who will be speaking later this year. People like John Applequist, who's an attorney and a judge, who all bring different perspectives than what Philip or I, with our training, could ever bring. Because when the world says, let's become less inclusive, our action says, let's become more inclusive. Our choice is going to be standing in favor of being affirming and inclusive instead of resigning to being comfortable. And that's not to say that oppression is comfortable. It's not, far from it. But rather, when we find ourselves resigned to staying where we are, it's often because staying where we are is more comfortable than moving. And that's actually where the story provides so much hope and direction. Because after David finally convinces King Saul to let him fight Goliath, I want you to see how the story goes. It says that then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened the sword over his tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I can't go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. You see, David understood that the system that created the oppression, the system that had created the fear, was also the same system that would have said, we need to fight fairly. We need to fight it using the weapons that everyone else has ever used. But when oppression is the result of the system of the tools that we've always used, we've got to change the tools that we use. And that's the final thought for today. That when the tools that you've been given don't work, find the tools that do. When the tools that you've been given don't work, find the tools that do. You see, David realizes that the tools that he would have been given would never work. So he uses the tools that make more sense to him. He goes down, he grabs 5 smooth stones and a sling. Don't think about it like a bean flipper, by the way. It wasn't like that. It was an artillery weapon. Malcolm Gladwell, who studied the story a lot for his book, David vs. Goliath, said this: it is because of, and not despite, David's size and unorthodox choice of weapon that he's able to slay the lumbering giant. David's sling is a devastating weapon. And it was devastating because it could be fired from a long distance. It could be fired as fast as a .45 caliber bullet. So David didn't win because he was an underdog and there was something going on. David won because he used the tools that were different than the tools that had ever been used. But even though it was the most effective weapon, it was not what the system would have used. I imagine there were those standing up on the hill saying, well, that's not a very manly way to fight. Or saying things like, That's not very dignified. Or maybe the most dangerous phrase in the English language, we've never done it that way. But David didn't do it that way. It said that as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. And reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. You see, David used the tools that he was comfortable with, the tools that he knew from his time as a shepherd, defending the sheep from prey. And like I said, there's a lot of debate about this story. There are people who think that the story actually says he got hit in the leg and then fell over. There's another story where David gets beheaded, or Goliath gets beheaded. And we don't know exactly how that played out, but I do think there's a truth in this. And it comes from this. Last week, I was meeting with a very dear friend of mine who introduced me to a phrase that I think is so important for this. It's a phrase that's used as a mantra in Kundalini yoga, and it's Sutnam. And it means this: truth is my identity. I imagine that if David was walking down the hill and was familiar with this history, he might have said this. That he walks down and says, this is my identity. The truth is my identity. You know, just like David, we've often been told that resignation is our identity. That systemic bias is just the way it is. We've been told, like Dr. Jemison, that we mean something other than what we say, or that we should live some way other than who we are. And when we are told that, it can be overwhelming because we don't have the tools to cut through the stress. But maybe we do. Maybe we just need a shopkeeper to come around and be like Los Zapatos Grandes to show us where the tools are. A week from Tuesday, on August 12th, we're going to be starting our next session of Rise. And we need shopkeepers. Rise is our program that helps people who are struggling with financial self-sufficiency. It's one of our social justice projects here. And we need mentors and coaches who will help people say, Los Zapatos Grandes. If you would be willing to be a shopkeeper, to be a mentor, to be a coach, go talk to Josh right after service. You can also text Rise to our text number. You can contact him at josh@thevenues.org, because we need people who will stand next to each other and walk through this together. We all need help finding the tools that work for us. Sometimes it's financial. Sometimes it's time management. Sometimes it's just trying to figure out how to be connected to other people. Sometimes our sandals break. The elements around us don't work. So this week, let's commit to helping each other find the tools that we can all use together.